All right, kids. Second half, Roaring Twenties, and we start with an invention. The internal combustion engine changes everything. It's actually much older than you think it is. You probably think of it as a 20th century phenomenon with automobiles and all that. Actually, it is invented before, wait for it, the Civil War.
Although it's hard to believe, this isn't actually an explosion. It's just a very rapid combustion, a very rapid fire. The early internal combustion engines were often called explosion engines, though, and I think it's really a much more appropriate name. The first successful explosion engine was built by an inventor called Etienne Lenoir in 1859. He simply threw away the boiler of a steam engine and modified it so that it would ignite the piped gas supplied for lighting. Unfortunately, the violence of the explosions tended to damage the piston and valves, and it was much less efficient than the original steam engine. However, his engine inspired other inventors, including a German wholesale grocery salesman called Nicholas Otto.
Herr Otto.
Otto came up with an engine that was much more efficient. His engines were immediately successful, and he sold over 35,000 to power factories and workshops. One of the first Otto engines to be built in Britain was the 1895 Hornsby Ackroyd. It all still looks very like a steam engine, but it runs on paraffin, another product of refining crude oil. It first has to be heated to make it an inflammable vapour. It's a two-man job to start it, and it never goes around faster than 100 times a minute. What's going on inside is that first the vapour is sucked into the cylinder, then it's compressed, ignited, and finally the exhaust gases are pushed out. This sequence, suck, squash, bang, blow, is called the four-stroke cycle. Otto's big improvement was squashing the vapour up before igniting it, which gave the engine much more power. Although from the outside a modern car engine looks completely different, and it's obviously got more than one cylinder, inside it's really quite similar. Otto's engines were much too large and clumsy for a car, but one of his employees, called Gottlieb Daimler, developed a much smaller engine in 1883. This ran much faster and used the volatile petrol as the fuel. It produced nearly as much power as Otto's, but weighed 10 times less. Daimler's high-speed engine finally made the idea of the car practical, and it was quickly realised that cars could do some quite remarkable things.
So, the basic principle of an internal combustion engine is not that different from a steam engine. That instead of steam pushing the piston up and down and the vacuum created by pulling the steam out, you are rapidly combusting fuel vapor, in this case, petroleum-based product, gasoline, or as the British call it, petrol. It goes all the way back to 1859 to a Frenchman, Etienne Lenoir, but it's really the Germans, not surprisingly, who perfect this. Nicholas Otto, ironically named Otto, and Gottlieb Daimler. And if Daimler sounds familiar, he will go on to found, be one of the founding partners in a little company called Mercedes-Benz. Will eventually be called Mercedes-Benz. So you have these three Europeans. So by the middle of the 1880s, you have really an effective, compact engine that doesn't require huge boilers. See, because though it works on the same principle as a steam engine, what a steam engine requires is an enormous boiler. The front end of a locomotive in the 19th century is so huge because it's a giant water tank that you are heating up mainly by burning coal. This basically takes all that out of the equation, so you can have a much more compact unit. Much more compact unit means that you can have engines in smaller things. So instead of a locomotive, you can have an automobile. This is the first one, right here. The Benz Patent Motorwagen. Motorwagen automobile. It's got 3 wheels and a 1 horsepower engine. This is the first British quote-unquote automobile. It's basically a bicycle with 4 wheels and a fun seat on the front. This is kind of the first modernish car. It's built in France. And so to take us through the early days of the automobile, I'm going to turn things over to some British guys who run a television program on the BBC that is the most watched television program on planet Earth. It's a little program called Top Gear. Take it away, boys.
This is the very first car ever made. The Benz Patent Motorwagen from 1896. This is Genesis.
And it's absolutely nothing like the cars we know today. For a start, it has this tiller steering arrangement, which is exactly the sort of thing you'd find on a canal boat. And it also only has a single front wheel, so presumably if you're a bit too vigorous with this, the whole thing could topple over.
Performance? Not great. It has a 1-cylinder, 1-litre engine, which gives a top speed of 9. And with a 1.5-litre fuel tank, its range is only 5 miles. Tricky when the petrol station hadn't been invented, but it did show the world that personal, motorised transportation was possible.
3 years later, the British came up with this, the Royal Enfield.
That's not the brake!
Its controls were hideously complicated, but there were some good points.
This had twice the power of the Benz, 2 horsepower. But most important of all, it had 4 wheels. So what they've accidentally designed here is the quad bike.
One of the biggest problems with these early cars is getting them going in the first place. The starter motor hasn't been invented yet. There's no ignition key. You have to use the starting handle.
And the great thing about this particular car, the Didion Bouton, is that when you turn the handle, it will break your wrist.
You what?
7 members of staff at the Motor Museum have had their wrists broken by this very car.
Well, we don't actually need to drive it. We can just stand around and talk about it.
No, this is one of the very first cars that sold in great numbers. We have to know what it was like. You're going to have to get it going.
Having got it started, we needed to get it moving, and for that we had a copy of the original handbook, which had been translated from French, because the car was made in France, into English. Literally.
For making the carriage walking at the first speed, take back the drag of the wheel backward crowbar of the right, and take completely and progressively back the crowbar of embrayage to you, while you keep the direction. Hurl the mover till his starting.
I can understand why this is better than going around looking at a horse's bottom. But how did anyone ever figure out how it worked?
We've established that that's the gear lever. Yeah. That's the advanced thing, the ignition. Yeah. That's something important. This was designed for someone with 3 arms and 1 leg.
Right.
If you need to do a hill start, you have to steer it with your chest.
Or your face. It would be difficult. How do I get it into top gear?
taking the second speed, push rapidly at the crowbar forward without brutality. When it is raised up again, it gains all its strength.
Yes!
Yeah! Top gear!
Now how do I stop?
What?
Well, I'm going to have to stop eventually. This road won't go on forever.
Pull the movers. No.
Seriously.
I don't know, James. I don't know.
You're in charge of the instructor.
They're injuries. I brought them as a joke for the viewer.
Oh, God, there's a...
For making the carriage completely stopped. When it goes at 15 kilometres an hour, take abruptly the crowbar of embrayage.
Right.
No, wait, we haven't finished.
No, well, you haven't got very long. Come on.
When you are in first speed, push we aren't, are we? Dave, we're going to be
I decided to use ingenuity.
I'm losing friction.
I've got what? That's neutral. I've got neutral.
It's my window, is it? Stop it!
I don't know how to do it.
Stop!
So these early attempts at automobiles leave quite a bit to be desired. The Didion Bouton from France 1904, the Royal Enfield from England 1899, and the Benz Patent Motorwagen from 1896. As James May said, this is Genesis. But these cars sell in tiny little numbers. For the first decade or more of the automobile is a toy for the super rich. Until a man named Henry Ford takes the inspiration from the meat packing industry and their disassembly lines in Packingtown in Chicago, running those carcasses, and each person taking a certain slice off of the carcass, disassembling the carcass as it goes down the line. Instead of one person butchering the whole cow, one person does the same cut over and over again. He takes that idea and reverses it to an assembly line. And they make one car, for all intents and purposes, the Model T. Make 239 in 1908. By 1917, 750,000 cars. Something like 15 million Model Ts will be produced. A truly staggering number. By 1925, they are producing one car in a factory every 10 seconds. It's coming off the line. In 1913, 12 years earlier, it took 13 hours to make one car. This is mass production. And what this means, significantly, is that Ford can reduce the price every year. So, here's a 1912 advertisement. The cheapest model comes in at $590. The most expensive, $900. 1914 prices, the cheapest model is $500, and the most expensive is $750. 1915, the cheapest is $390, and the most expensive is $640. So you've gone from $590 in 1912 to $390 in 1915. And that is the years of the rapid increase in production. In 1913, it took 13 hours to produce a car. In 1914, 1.5 hours. And by 1925, it's 10 seconds. And by the early 1920s, mid-1920s, 85% of all cars in the world are produced in the United States, and almost all those are produced in and around Detroit, Michigan. And this becomes one of the great destinations of the Great Migration. The blacks coming out of the South move to the cities in the North, and one of the cities that they go to in large numbers is Detroit to work in factories like Henry Ford's factory. But is the Model T a modern car, you ask? Good question. No.
You might imagine that the first car to get everything in the right order was the first car ever to be mass-produced. The Model T Ford. By the time it went out of production in 1927, half the cars in the world were Model Ts. So you'd imagine that all the cars that came along afterwards would be laid out in the same way. Luckily, they weren't.
Honestly, I'm glad this didn't catch on, because driving a Model T is more complicated than doing eye surgery. It's almost as though Henry Ford was being, I don't know, deliberately obtuse, because to make it move, you have to up the revs with the accelerator, which is here on the steering wheel, there. Then you move the handbrake to the middle, which somehow puts the car in neutral, and then depress the left pedal. Yeah! The only problem is, to maintain this speed, I have to keep my foot pressed far down on what feels like a very, very heavy clutch pedal. And the pain in my thigh is excruciating. The only way around this is to change into top gear. Now, to do that, we have to go faster. Push this lever, the handbrake, and this is the handbrake all the way down. Then I can take my foot off that pedal.
Now the speed shoots up, whether you like it or not, to about 40. And 40 on wooden wheels in a world with hardly any roads is terrifying.
So the Model T is not a modern car, but it is the first car produced in huge numbers. And it puts America on wheels. More Americans per capita have cars than any other country in the world, really until the 1950s. That Europe catches up in terms of automobiles per capita. And a huge part of the reason is the Model T. It gets cheaper every year, which is a very novel concept considering the way pricing of cars goes today. And one of the reasons it gets cheaper every year is the car that's produced in 1908 is virtually the same car that's produced in 1927. Yes, there are some modifications and improvements here and there, but for all intents and purposes, it's the same car. And if you're producing the same car over and over and over again, economies of scale come in and you can charge less. And so the price drops year after year after year. Now, it's still an expensive object. The poor aren't driving cars. But the lower middle class, factory workers even, can begin to afford these by the 1920s. Another thing that's happening during this time period is the result of another invention, an invisible invention, dare I say. Radio. Now, the invention or inventor of radio is controversial. Some people will say it's invented by Nikola Tesla, a Serbian who immigrates to the United States and sets up shop on Long Island around 1895. There are some who say it's Guglielmo Marconi, an Italian working in Italy, inventing it in 1896. He does immigrate to the United States. Whether it's Tesla, whether it's Marconi, doesn't really matter for our purposes. What we can say definitively is that by the turn of the 20th century, radio, the wireless transmission initially of telegraph signals, because the telegraph had been invented in 1844, but you needed wires between the two stations. This is often known as they originally call it wireless telegraphy, or the wireless telegraph. It's only later that voice gets transmitted along these wires, in much the same way that it took over 30 years for the progress from the telegraph to the telephone. And it's really not until after World War I that radio is commercialized. And one of the reasons it's after World War I is that there's a big surplus of Army radios that come onto the market after the end of the war. And the first radio company, corporation, is the creatively named Radio Corporation of America, better known by its acronym RCA. In 1920 in Pittsburgh, interestingly, the first radio station goes on the air, KDKA, still in operation today, approaching its 100th anniversary. And I want to read some excerpts to you from a 1921 article from Scientific American magazine entitled A New Era in Wireless. No longer is this fascinating subject confined to the expert, for today all may enjoy its many benefits. Radio telephony has developed to such an extent that one does not need to be an expert to receive the messages of the air. It mentions KDKA, and that in this territory there are hundreds of thousands of persons who can hear concerts given nightly from this radio station. But not only phonograph music is being transmitted from this station, but also complete church services that feature every Sunday night. This article talks about what they envision as the future of radio. It's music, but it's also political. When Herbert Hoover visited Pittsburgh to tell his story about the starving children in Europe, remember he had been in charge of the Food Administration and the Belgian Relief Program, arrangements were made for sending this appeal broadcast by radio. Instead of making his plea to 100 or 200 men gathered at dinner, Mr. Hoover was able to reach thousands of people who stayed at home listening to their wireless sets. The farmer can receive crop reports. The tired businessman can get the high points of the latest news. Soon in radio, you'll be able to get popular music if you desire, or classical music, or church service, or speeches, or crop reports, or news. A way to instantaneously receive information. This is an information revolution. Before what we consider to be the information revolution of the internet. In 1926 and in 1928, the two major national broadcasting companies are founded. The National Broadcasting Company, better known by its acronym NBC, still in business today, and the Columbia Broadcasting System, also known as CBS, still in operation today. By 1923, just 3 years after KDKA goes on the air, there's 600 radio stations across the country. And if we look at the penetration into the home market, the numbers are really staggering. By 1930, 10 years after the first commercial radio station, 40% of American homes have a radio. By 1942, 80% of homes have a radio. And the number of people who are getting their entertainment and their news from radio skyrockets. Remember, newspapers had a monopoly on news. Now there's a new conduit, radio. And most people will experience World War II, for example, via the radio, by broadcast from London by people like Edward R. Murrow. Whereas World War I, they had just read about it. They're hearing about it on the radio. And so pervasive does radio become that in 1935, a young upstart actor, director, showman, if you will, named Orson Welles, convinces a lot of people in the New York, New Jersey area that Martians have invaded and are rampaging across the New Jersey countryside with his broadcast of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, written at the turn of the 20th century, a work of science fiction, a new genre that appears during the late Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century. And here's the New York Times headline from the next day: radio listeners in panic, taking war drama as fact. And here is the young, thin Orson Welles, part of his Mercury Radio theater company. They did basically dramas on the radio, and one of them they do is War of the Worlds, but done as a series of news broadcasts. Fools a lot of people. What's interesting about this front page is this side item here. I don't know if you can make it out in the video, but it says, ousted Jews find refuge in Poland after border stay. Ousted Jews from Germany. This is 1935. The Nazis have been in power for 2 years, and the situation for Jews in Germany is becoming dire as it will become for the rest of Europe in just a few short years. So shades of the future there. So with the radio, you have this huge entertainment medium that's born and develops very quickly from its arguably birth in 1920. It's invented before that, but no one has a radio before 1920, to becoming a feature in everyone's home in just 10 years. It's really remarkable. But there's another medium that becomes huge, and that is the motion pictures. That's the original Hollywood sign. Originally said Hollywood Land, and it had nothing to do with the movie industry. It was a sign for a housing development that never actually came to pass. It was called Hollywood Land. Eventually the land part falls off, and the Hollywood sign remains arguably one of the most recognizable landmarks in America. Originally had nothing to do with the thing for which it's associated with, and that is the motion picture industry. And this picture, I really like this picture. I'm not totally sure what's going on here. You've got guys in suits. You've got a mule team, and the guy in the suit has a plow. Not entirely sure what is going on here, but it's a nice shot of the Hollywood sign. Hollywood Land sign. The movie studios that set up shop in Hollywood are, quite interestingly, dominated by European immigrants. So Paramount Pictures Studio, still a major movie studio today, is founded by a Hungarian immigrant named Adolf Zucker, who lived to be 97 years old, which is quite impressive, and MGM, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, still a major studio today, founded by Samuel Goldwyn, a Polish immigrant, whose actual last name is not Goldwyn. He changed it when he came to this country. Actual name, Gelbfish. He anglicized it to Goldwyn. Also lives an incredibly long time. Both of these guys die in the mid-1970s. Born in the mid-1870s. That is, I find, to be really remarkable. So, good for you guys. Almost hit 100. The growth of the movie industry in some ways tracks the growth of the radio industry. In 1914, so the year that World War I breaks out, 7 million movie tickets are being sold a day. In other words, about 7 million Americans are going to a movie every single day. That's not the same Americans going every day, but the average American during the 1920s, especially the 1930s and 40s, was going to multiple movies a week. In 1930, 12 million tickets sold a day. 12 million Americans going to a movie every single day. Initially, the movies are what we call silent movies. And now you might think, well, silent movie means there's no sound. Well, there's no dialogue. But they did have music with them. And so for the first 15 or so, 15 years of the movie industry, there's no dialogue in the movies. So the actors would mouth lines on the screen, and then there'd be a cutaway to dialogue lines, and then it'd go back. In 1927, though, everything changes with a single movie. It's called The Jazz Singer. Stars Al Jolson, and it's the first film in which the dialogue of the actors is recorded and meshed with the film itself. It's also an amazingly racist movie, because this is America. You see, Al Jolson is a white guy who performs in, wait for it, blackface. The minstrel show. It's essentially a vaudeville show on the big screen. So we're going to watch a clip of it now, and it's rather shocking, the overtly racist nature of it. But this is America. there's one thing America does well, as we've learned, it's racism.
I know where the sunshine bent. Mammy, Mammy, my heart rings, my tangle around. Well, Mammy, I'm coming. Sorry, I need to wait. I'm coming. I hope it's right.
Well, we don't need to see any more of it. It's racist. This is a white guy performing in blackface as if he were in an old minstrel show. So what we have is a revolution. A mass media revolution. Between the invention of the telegraph in 1844 and the widespread use of the radio in the 1920s. Now, what's not in here is the television. Television is actually invented in it's invented in the 1920s, it's perfected in the 1930s, and makes its public debut in 1939 at the New York World's Fair, but its launch gets interrupted by World War II, and it's really not until the 1950s that television becomes a phenomenon. So we'll talk about it when we talk about the Cold War, post-war world. But by the 1920s, you have a mass media environment. From the telegraph to national newspapers like the Chicago Tribune and New York Times, the telephone, and then the visual industry of movies and the auditory industry of radio, what Ken Burns called an empire of the air. And this goes hand in hand with something we've seen in the retail industry. The big department stores, national brands, advertising, the Sears Roebuck catalog. The United States circa 1850 had been lots of little, largely isolated communities, and the railroad came along and began to integrate those communities into a more national fabric. Well, what all of this does, and what the retail revolution does, is to, what I think we can say is homogenize American culture. Make it possible to really experience the same thing whether you're in New Orleans or New York. Buy the same products. Watch the same productions. Life becomes much more national and much less local. Everything is changing here at the end of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century. Now, what you are going to be reading over spring break is the collapse of all of this in many ways. The readings will begin with the revenge of conservatism, the reaction against the progressive movement of the first 2 decades of the 20th century, with a string of Republican presidents, Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, and then the collapse of the entire system, led by the stock market, but with a cascading effect down the chain, in part because the way in which the economy works by the 1920s is that consumer spending in the retail sector plays a huge role. And when the stock market collapses, businesses fire a lot of workers, and those workers then stop buying stuff, and because they stop buying stuff, more factories close and have to fire their workers, and it's this vicious downward spiral. So that by 1931, you've got 25% unemployment, whereas in the summer of 1929, you had 5% unemployment. And so you'll read about basically the collapse of the entire capitalistic system and how it was saved through what we have to call socialist policies of the Roosevelt administration. He is a Democratic president. He is an aristocrat. He's born extremely wealthy, but he becomes the champion of the little man in a way that really no other president had been before. So that's what you're going to read about over spring break. So what we've done here in this unit is we've taken the United States onto the global stage, and then we've removed the United States from the global stage at the end of World War I. The United States will remain virulently isolationist throughout the 1920s and 30s. And in fact, as we're going to see at the end of March, most Americans don't care about the war in Europe until Pearl Harbor is bombed in December 1941. Most public opinion polls show that most Americans do not want to intervene, even to save England, in 1940 and 41. It's only until Japan attacks the United States that those sentiments change. We've seen how society changes, how the first generation gap emerges and will become really a facet of American and Western life right up to the present day. These flappers, these kids born in the first years of the 20th century have an entirely different life experience than their parents. And the refrain of parents just don't understand in many ways was born here in the 19-teens, but especially the 1920s and 1930s. So that is America Unleashed. Over break, you will read about America Hobbled. Have a good one.